Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started here in just a minute as everyone gets loaded in. All righty, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Kate Shanks. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs for the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. And I know many of you have probably joined us last year as we did webinar after webinar talking about the COVID-19 situation and helping businesses prepare, process, comply with the ever-changing guidance that was being published as we were in the throes of the pandemic. And we're starting to see some pretty significant changes to what employers are required to do. But it hasn't really created a decline in all of the challenges and dilemmas that employers are facing because of the pandemic. So we thought it would be good to revisit the COVID-19 liability conversation that we had last year. We have a couple of folks with us today that were in the panel last year, and just really kind of give it a new, fresh lay of the land about what employers are required to do and what some of the legal difficulties might be surrounding some of these changes that we're seeing, especially with Healthy at Work, with new CDC guidance. We now have vaccines that are readily available, and how are employers managing the vaccination situation in the workplace. And then, of course, we passed some very important legislation during the 2021 General Assembly, Senate Bill 5, that creates some COVID-19 liability protections for business. So we are going to try to cover all of that in just an hour. We are recording today, so if you need to step away for a moment, you can watch our recording. We'll post it on social media pages and on our website at kychamber.com later today if you need to step away. But we will get started and cover quite a bit of ground. I will also point out that we do have a chat box open. If you would like to ask questions during the program, we will save time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to do that. So to get us started today and to talk through all of these different topics, I've invited some experts to the panel. Joining me today are Cindy Effinger, who is a member with McBrayer Law Firm, where her main practice area is focused in employment and commercial litigation, dealing with business disputes, claims of discrimination and harassment, and wage and hour issues. We also have Jay Engel, member with Jackson Kelly in the healthcare industry group, focusing primarily on commercial litigation, labor and employment, health law, and equine law. And he is also our competitiveness policy council chair. So welcome, Jay. We have Kim O'Donnell, who is partner with Denton's in the firm's employment and labor practice group, where she advises and represents clients in matters involving a broad range of employment issues. And last but not least is Doug McSwain, partner in Wyatt, where he concentrates his practice in constitutional law, business, professional employment, civil rights, data privacy and security, and trade law. And Doug was in the trenches with me in passing Senate Bill 5. So we will spend some time discussing that legislation with him. But first, I want to talk about the new guidance, the new CDC rules on masking. The governor last week made announcements related to workplace standards for COVID. And the CDC announced that vaccinated people did not need to wear masks indoors or outdoors. And the governor then announced too that come June 11th, the mask mandate would be rescinded except for in a few conditions. We also saw some new announcements from OSHA, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, on conforming with CDC. So Cindy, I'll start with you. What do employers need to know about these new announcements? And is this good news for all of us?
So I think initially we all thought it was good news, right? We had a bright line test. Vaccinated people did not need to worry about masks. Unvaccinated people should still wear their mask. It seems to make sense given the pandemic, what we've lived through the last few years. And we thought this is great news until we sat down and helped our employers and clients try to write a new policy and a new announcement, which was met with a lot of frustration and questions and pointing fingers and feeling guilty. We've had, issues ranging from, people just unvaccinated people not wearing masks and how employers are going to enforce that, at least for the next 3 weeks. We've had individuals who are complaining that the employer isn't enforcing the new mask policy and having to decide between, well, we're either going to have everybody wear it or we're going to have this delineation. And then you have questions that relate to, well, wait, can they really ask me about my vaccination status? Can they really treat me differently? And I know we're going to get into that later in this webinar, but it brought with us the happiness that it brought with it, with the announcement was met with a lot of questions and concerns. So what do employers need to know? You need to know that, you know, the current mandate or the current mask mandate is still in place with one exception, that vaccinated individuals do not have to wear masks. You as an employer get to create your own policy within that framework. You can say, nope, everybody's still going to wear them, or you can say, we're going to follow this. And then you have to know and decide how you're going to enforce it. Are you going to send the individuals home who you know are not vaccinated, or who you've asked for proof of vaccination and proof that they're not? You're going to send them home if they refuse to wear a mask? What are you going to do when someone complains that someone else is not wearing a mask? And how you are going to communicate that in a way that doesn't completely blow up your morale, your environment, and navigate it at least for the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about morale and how we're going to not only make sure we are complying with whatever the rules are in place, but how we implement them and execute and manage the different things. And Kim, I'll throw it to you. I mean, do you think that different types of businesses, especially different size businesses, are going to handle these changes differently? And also any thoughts on OSHA and some of their announcements recently? Can we expect some new or clarifying rules coming down from OSHA? Oh, Kim, I can't hear you.
Okay.
Oh, I can hear you now.
There we go now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I don't know what I did, but I'm not going to touch anything because I know I was not on mute. I have already learned that lesson over the last 14 months. But as far as different kinds of clients and different size businesses, I am seeing different reactions from very large employers versus smaller employers and smaller clients of mine. You know, as we know, there are some large national retailers that have said, well, we're just going to go entirely maskless given this CDC guidance because there's no way for us to enforce this. Obviously, we don't want to mention specific entities or retailers, but we all know who those are. I am seeing the same sort of general, it's all or nothing with large employers and clients of mine. So a lot of my clients that have, you know, maybe 80 to 100 to hundreds or thousands of employees are saying, look, this guidance is only in place for us in Kentucky for 3 weeks. We are just going to stick with our policy as it has been for the last 14 months, and everyone needs to wear masks and everyone needs to social distance, etc. And then in 3 weeks, when the governor says the rules are going to change on June 11th, we will readdress this issue and we'll have a policy in place for when June 11th is actually a Friday. So when Monday, June 14th rolls around, we're going to have this new policy in place. And that gives us time as the attorney to talk with the client about what that policy should say, how it should be implemented, and a lot of those issues that Cindy just brought up, such as how are we going to enforce those sorts of things. You know, it gives us an opportunity to digest this information and then produce that new policy on June 14th with what we expect the governor's announcement to be on June 11th, based on his announcement last week. As far as OSHA guidance, it was interesting for a few days there because we had the CDC announcement that vaccinated people need to wear or do not need to wear masks indoors, whereas unvaccinated people do. But we still had guidance from OSHA that said you should not treat vaccinated and unvaccinated employees any different from one another. There shouldn't be any distinction on how they're treated. Now, as of Monday, I believe it was, OSHA came out and said, well, we're going to rework all of our guidance. In the meantime, you're okay to follow what the CDC has said. So we don't expect to see any enforcement actions from OSHA related to mask wearing or having vaccinated people unmasked in the workplace. So stay tuned on that. As everything else with COVID, this is a rapidly evolving and changing environment. And we'll see what OSHA has to say in the coming weeks. But for right now, employers are good to just follow the CDC's guidance.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And, we are in this 3-week window that, between the CDC on you can take off your mask if you're vaccinated, and the governor's plans for removing the mask mandate June 11th. So I could see where some employers are just going to status quo, just probably for the ease of not having to change it, especially if you're a large employer and you have to educate your staff on what they're supposed to do. So I think that's a good point and a very important point of clarification. Cindy, any other feedback on, do we expect to see some employers just saying, you know what, they're relaxing the guidance, but I'm still going to do all these 3 things. I'm still going to do the health check. I'm still going to do the surface cleaning, the 6 feet. Do you think they're going to keep some of these practices in place, or do you think it starts to create some challenges, if you've got workers that don't want to continue to do the health screening, for example?
Yeah, I think it will create challenges because for 14 months, people have, complained about these protocols, complained that they shouldn't have to do them. Employers are also, it's an extra burden on employers. And if we don't need to, and I say need to in terms of this pandemic, continue the social distancing, continue the health checks, I think those will go away because they also come with them some challenges, right? I mean, to maintain that social distance or to ask the health check, certainly some employers have realized the challenges about asking for health screens and getting information they otherwise didn't want. I think we've learned a few things too, though, just about public health, right? We've cleaned more, we've washed our hands more, and I think we saw, a decrease in the flu because of it, and probably a decrease in other illnesses, which is a good thing. So I hope that some of those stick around, but I think some of the more burdensome things, such as keeping the distance and the health screens, I don't think there'll be a whole lot of tolerance on either the employer or the employee side. And I'm not so sure we would need to continue those once the real threat is gone. Unfortunately, I think the real threat is going to be around for a few more months until we decide whether we need booster shots, whether we have additional surges, what's going to happen in the fall. But hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a better picture of what we'll still need to do to make sure that we don't end up back to where we were maybe even 6, 8, 10 months ago.
Yeah, and I did see recently one business was continuing to do curbside, not because of the pandemic, but because it's a service their customers wanted. And so I think that's a whole other element, a whole other conversation from what we're having today, is that are some of those businesses that did takeout, delivery, curbside, going to find that that's a value added service that their customers are going to expect post COVID. So I think that's a really interesting thing to follow as well. But so Jay, I'll kick it over to you and talk a little bit about this new normal. Are people coming back to the office? Will people work remote forever? There's so much conversation about it, but just kind of walk us through, employers bringing people back into the office and what some of the challenges might be. Can you require your employees to return to the office if they have been on a work from home arrangement?
Yeah, Kate, and we're certainly, even before last Thursday, we were getting more and more of those questions and people putting plans in place. I know one of my clients had, had a conversation with me and had spent a couple weeks putting back together their return to work policy and when they were going to require masks and what settings and all of this, and had a management meeting scheduled Friday morning to roll it out. And then there's the CDC announcement. So a lot of people are revisiting that, but I think the trend was already towards starting to bring people back either kind of on a voluntary basis, or seeing some businesses mandating people come back. Some have already done that. My firm hasn't. You can see I'm still at home, but ours, we kind of got it wasn't a mandate, but it was we'd really like to see everybody back by June 15th. So yes, you can. You can, and certainly with this, I think you're going to see more employers say, hey, it's time to come back. I want everybody back. As a practical matter, I think you're going to see some more flexibility. Certainly in certain industries, employers have seen that their employees can be productive at home or remotely. And I've certainly had this conversation with colleagues and clients. What we've all found is our productive employees who are productive at work are also productive at home. Our employees who aren't as productive or who goof off and distract others at work still aren't productive at home. They just don't distract others as much. So I think you're going to see more flexibility, and it's, one of those balancing. I think you'll hear us say a lot today. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of black and white rules right now. Even as Kim said, OSHA and the CDC weren't on the same page for a few days. So it's challenging. And I think those are going to be the challenges. But, to answer your question, yes, you can have people come back. You should be careful about it. Some of the things we talked about last year, I think most employers have realized this, but some of our natural instincts, like at this time last year, we were talking about employers were like, okay, I'm going to have only my older population stay home because they're more at risk, or I want to keep, my pregnant population or people I know have health concerns. I'm going to have them stay at home because I'm protecting them. Well, it was good natured and well intended, but very well walked you right into, an ADA or Title VII claim. So you're going to have some of those same concerns when you start talking about bringing people back. You're going to have to consider accommodations, and you can't just make a blanket rule like for a general population like that. I think it's, going to have to be more on a case by case basis. And then, some of the guidance from the EEOC earlier was, you may want to consider educating everybody about accommodations and whether they can ask for one. I'm practical enough to know that there's concern with some employers that if you do that, you're inviting people to use it as an excuse. So it's some of those balances that are going to continue. And I saw one of our first questions in the chat was, will you still be at risk if you don't manage this properly? And I think the same advice applies. Now, Doug will talk about some of the protections that thankfully the chamber and Doug's hard work got built in. But the main thing is to be paying attention to it, to come up with a plan, to come up with a policy that's well reasoned, consult the resources, consult the guidance. And I think, if you're doing what a reasonable employer would do, that's going to give you the best type of protection. So I'd say by being on this webinar, you're actually helping your employer and helping you to think, because you're going to be able to show that you're being proactive to try to do the best you could, even under these difficult circumstances with changing guidance.
Yeah, and I did see a second question come in about, should you continue to track when employees come back into the office in case there is another resurgence of infections? And so that kind of brings us back to, almost contact tracing. And if you have people who aren't vaccinated, because people who are vaccinated don't have to isolate anymore. But if you have people who aren't, you still need to have that tracking so that you can do contact tracing if there is a case, because it's not over. And probably we will see cases popping up here and there. So, those are sort of some best practices, I think, that would still be in place. Do you think?
Yeah, and I think part of that's probably a two-part question. One is, should you do it? And first and foremost, when you develop your policy, make sure you follow it. Policies can be great helps, but they can be your biggest enemy too. If you write a great policy and then it doesn't get implemented, we've all seen that can be a disaster if litigation ever comes. You write this policy that says safety and health of our employees is of utmost concern, and we're going to do these three things. And then your CEO or your HR or your compliance director is in a deposition and they just walk through that policy and say, no, you said you need to do all these things to protect your employees, and employee safety is of utmost importance. And you care about your employees, don't you, Ms. Shanks? And when you wrote this, you knew this was all important. Did you do this? No. Did you do this? I mean, so follow your policy, whatever you land on, first and foremost. Writing it is one thing, implementing it is another. And then I guess the other question is, do you include that tracking? And I think that probably depends on some of the other decisions you make. I think you certainly, if somebody reports a case of COVID or has symptoms that get reported, you need to have a process in place and document what you did, whether you need to have vaccinated employees fill out a daily health screening. I'd say most people are probably doing away with that, but it's just part of your overall plan. And I don't, Kim or Cindy or Doug may have other thoughts on that.
Doug, do you want to weigh in here on any of these topics?
Yeah, let me weigh in from this direction. There's no problem, according to our own governor's EEO, when he, EO, that he issued, executive order, but that he issued on May the 11th, I believe it was, in any event, where he set the June the 11th deadline and relaxed some of the interim requirements. Some of the provisions of that executive order plainly state that employers may choose to continue with their mask mandates on the employer premises. And so I don't want us to forget, just because things are relaxing, and certainly during this short period of time, it is clearly a valid choice for employers to continue to choose, I'm not changing anything, we're going to continue to do what we've been doing, and let's see where we land on June the 11th and reassess the situation. I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just, because you may have some morale issues. There's maybe some that want to object to that, but I want it to be very clear that just because the floor is lowering with respect to the amount of controls that employers may need to do in their workplace, you don't have to do that. You can continue with it. The other thing I want to point out is that his executive order, I think, states what should be obvious, and we haven't really talked about some of the differences between some of the industries. But this is not a relaxation of the mask mandate and other requirements across the board. There are certain industries that are clearly, and even in his executive order last week, plainly stated to be under the continuation of the heightened requirements. And that is, with a broad stroke, I'll just say healthcare industry. Healthcare providers are clearly subject to the mask mandate continuing. Long-term care facilities are clearly subject to the mask mandate continuing. And I would fill in the gap there between, because his executive order uses the term long-term care, but not all facilities that take care of seniors are actually classified as long-term care in a strictest sense of it. Many of them are assisted living or senior living facilities that just are congregate living settings. Homeless shelters as congregate living are also part of the ones that continue with the mask mandate. And I think you can read between the lines to assume that all senior facilities that have congregate living arrangements should continue with their mask mandate. And so I want to make sure that we are classifying between industries. Regular businesses that don't have that kind of congregate living situation with a major exposure to seniors or more vulnerable populations are clearly allowed to start relaxing things. That's really all I think I will add at this point, Kate. I just want to make sure everybody's aware that there is a difference across the board, a difference between industries, and that this is not across the board.
Let's move on and talk about vaccines, because that is a hot topic and probably something every employer is dealing with. There may be some that have 100% vaccination rates among their staff, but I bet a lot that don't. And so I think we need to talk a little bit about managing this in the workplace. So Cindy, first up, can employers require their employees to become vaccinated? And if they refuse, what do they do?
So yes, an employer can require the vaccination. We are not recommending that. I don't know. I haven't really heard of any industry that's recommending that there be a vaccine mandate in a particular industry or in particular employment setting. you'll have to take your business and your business needs on an individualized basis to determine whether you should have a vaccine mandate. If an employee refuses and you do choose to have a vaccine mandate, then the short answer is they can be fired. Or you can require them to work from home, subject to a couple of exemptions under the ADA and Title VII for disability or medical related exceptions, that they cannot receive the vaccine because the doctor recommends it, or they have a religious exemption that for some reason it is a violation of their religious beliefs to accept the vaccine, and those have to be accommodated. So we're going to have to engage in the interactive process like we would for any ADA or religious accommodation. The process would be no different. We'd have to go through that if you're going to require vaccines for your employees.
So there are some accommodations and some exemptions on the books for employers, and that's not a new law. Employers have had the right to require vaccines. And in certain settings, such as Doug mentioned, healthcare, there may have been instances in the past where with like maybe the flu shot, it was required. So
or tetanus shot, right? Or tetanus shot, yeah.
That's another good example. So that is not a new option that employers have. But so if we're not seeing them mandated, Jay, can you talk a little bit about this incentive that employers may be offering to those who are vaccinated? And it seems like a pretty simple thing. You just maybe give out some gift cards, but can you get in hot water over that if you're providing incentives to your workers?
Yeah, it can certainly raise issues, and I think all of us here have had kind of the same experience that Cindy mentioned, not having a lot of clients or seeing a lot of employers mandate vaccines. What we've seen more of is somebody coming up with an incentive program, and probably the most common I've seen is some extra time off or PTO. And that's ranged in everything from, a couple hours for the time to go get the vaccine, to, maybe adding, an extra day to whatever your standard PTO policy is. I've also seen some employers giving, more monetary type benefits, whether usually more of a gift card type incentive than cash. I think pretty consistent advice there is, that's okay, but don't get carried away. Don't make it, too big. Make it an incentive, something they can use, 25, 50. I think I've even seen some go as high as $100, but, somewhere in that lower range, so you don't cross over. And there's a couple things you could cross over in. If you could get much higher than that, you might have to start worrying about some wage an hour. Is it the discretionary bonus, or does it have to be calculated into your regular rate? And I think at those lower amounts, you're not going to have to worry about that. But then you can run into the same problems, as with mandates. If say, my employer, Jackson Kelly, said, we'll give you a $50 gift card if you go get vaccinated. And I come and say, I'd love to, but I can't because I've got a health condition. Can I still have my $50? I would if I wasn't prohibited. Then it opens up that same inquiry. Certainly one approach I've seen some employers take, usually the smaller ones, is, okay, we're just going to take people's word for it. We don't want to start asking follow-up questions, inadvertently turn it into a medical inquiry. If you start asking, well, why can't you be vaccinated? And the person starts sharing their health information, you've opened up a whole can of worms and possibly, ADA implications. So most I'm seeing are saying, if we're going to do an incentive program, and if somebody does come forward with a request like that, we're just going to go ahead and give them the incentive. Obviously, if you get into a situation where too many people you feel like you're gaming the system and coming up with kind of excuses that aren't real plausible, you might have to revisit that.
So it's Seems simple, but could get complicated pretty quickly. But we know it's popular, and a lot of workplaces have wellness programs too. And perhaps they
Right.
want to kind of fold it into an existing wellness program. And then that way you have other options if you can't get vaccinated. You can.
Yeah, and it's certainly a lot easier if you have a wellness program that already has some incentives that are similar built in to kind of just follow the same rules you have for those. You've got a little bit of a precedent to follow.
So I do see a question in the chat. I'm going to move on to Kim about, can you, sticking with the vaccination, can you require proof? Are you allowed to, keep the card on file? Like, does this run into any sort of medical inquiry that Jay mentioned? Is there a HIPAA deal we got to talk about? Are you allowed to ask who's vaccinated, and can you require proof? And what do you do with that information if you get it?
That's a great question, Kate, and one that we've been getting often in the last few weeks as people are getting, more and more people are getting vaccinated and coming into the workplace. So to answer the initial question, are you able to require proof of vaccination? The EEOC has come forward and tried to clarify that for everyone and said, yes, you can ask employees to provide proof of vaccination through producing their vaccination cards. So that question has been answered by the EEOC. The next question is, with this new CDC guidance saying that vaccinated people don't have to mask in the workplace, are employers required to get that proof of vaccination? Or, as someone asked in the chat here, can you just go on the honor system? Can you have a policy that says, in the first instance, okay, if you want to go maskless in the workplace and you're vaccinated, that's great. You need to come and bring your vaccination card to HR or to management, and then you can go maskless in the workplace. The EEOC has said, yes, you can have a policy like that. Do you have to? The CDC guidance does not require that. It says that you could also have a policy whereby you say, all right, we're just going to go on the honor system. Any employee that is fully vaccinated under the CDC guidance can go maskless in our workplace, whereas unvaccinated employees have to continue to wear the mask. So you could have either policy. Are there risks with both? Absolutely. Do we have enough time today on our webinar to talk through all of the risks with both? No, we don't. Either way, if you require the vaccination card, you're going to have some people that say, I don't want to give you my vaccination card. That's none of your business. And then on the other side, if you do the honor system, are you going to have employees calling each other out and saying, well, wait, I know Kate's not vaccinated. We talked about it last week and she's going maskless in the office this week. So both kinds of policies could have issues and problems. And there are risks with both. If you do require the vaccination card or employees to produce their vaccination card, you can either, keep a running list of the people that have shown the vaccination card, or you can actually keep physical copies of the card. Either way, if you keep a list, if you keep copies of the card, that is confidential medical information of that employee. It should be stored separately in a separate medical file and kept secure. It should not be just plopped in the employee's ordinary personnel file and then put in a file cabinet that's not locked. It should be maintained securely in a separate medical file because it is confidential medical information. And then you also mentioned HIPAA, which is a great point. Most employers are not going to be covered by HIPAA because they're not covered entities under HIPAA. There are exceptions there. If you're a healthcare facility, you may be a covered entity under HIPAA. There are instances where you may be categorized or qualify as a business associate under HIPAA. So, depending on the type of workplace, reach out to your legal advisor and they can give you more information about HIPAA, whether or not you're a covered entity. For most businesses, the answer is going to be no, you're not a covered entity under HIPAA. For some of those healthcare settings and other employers, you could be. So again, we don't have necessarily the time today to go through each of the categories, but that's the general idea.
So you can request the information, you can keep the card on file as long as it's protected in a special way, or you can use the honor system. Both have pros and cons. And these are the dilemmas that employers face. And probably we can't, as this panel, decide for you, which is best, but just know that there's no those are the options. No easy way. And I think too, imagine, people talk. So let's say I know Jay didn't get his shot. I have to work next to Jay and I have a compromised immune system and couldn't get vaccinated. He's not wearing a mask, but he's bragging that he didn't get the shot. Do you then have an accommodation problem for me because I couldn't get it? And I think, right, there's going to be those case by case situations, right?
That's absolutely right. Some employers are also, putting in their new mask policies. We discourage employees from discussing vaccination status in the workplace. Please only discuss your vaccination status with HR, which can be a good idea, but then you're creating, do you want to go around and discipline everybody that talks about vaccination status in the workplace? Because if you have a policy like that, you need to apply it uniformly and do exactly what Jay just said. You have to enforce a policy if you have it. So if you are saying that you might discipline an employee for discussing vaccination status in the workplace, you got to follow through with that warning and apply it uniformly. And there's also, we've got a lot of great questions in the chat. Are you able to have a copy of the vaccination card on file? Yes, you can. We answered that one. What's the benefit of asking for the vaccination card if it isn't required? That's a great question. I actually just had an hour-long conversation internally about that question. The benefit of asking for the card if it isn't required, there are benefits for not asking for it, as we discussed. The benefit of asking for it if it isn't required is perhaps if someone were to come forward with an OSHA claim and say that you are not keeping this workplace safe because you're allowing people to walk around willy-nilly without their masks on, it could be a benefit to the employer to be able to say, well, no, we're not allowing people to willy-nilly walk around without masks on. We are only allowing employees that are vaccinated and fully vaccinated under the CDC guidance to walk around without masks on. And as an added layer of protection, we're requiring them to produce their vaccination card to us. And so we know who's vaccinated and who's not. So there is a benefit, or could potentially be a benefit, if someone did make an OSHA claim that, there's a workplace safety issue. If you are asking for the vaccination cards, you can say, no, we're acting reasonably and we're requiring the cards. If you allow unvaccinated employees to go without a mask, do you have any advice on how to administer that? Obviously, I can't tell all of my supervisors who is vaccinated. That's exactly right. Leah made a great point. I also, if someone's producing their vaccination card, there needs to be a single or individual or HR, a few individuals who are designated to receive that information. You don't want to have the supervisors collecting those vaccination cards, because then you could later on have issues with ADA, if people are bringing up medical conditions. You don't want the supervisors going to those employees and saying, okay, well, who's vaccinated? Give me your cards. Well, Kate, you're not vaccinated. Why aren't you vaccinated? That could get into medical inquiries under the ADA, and we don't want our supervisors having those conversations with employees. So I do recommend having either a single individual, if you're small enough, or a few designated individuals to obtain those cards, not all of your supervisors across the company.
Kate, if I could jump in, there's one more pro that I think may need to be mentioned. I know we're talking about a lot of the negatives and the pros and on what to do here, but there is one for those who are interested on a certain incentive, and that's like paid time off, paid sick time off. The recently enacted American Rescue Plan that just happened, last month. The American Rescue Plan has got a provision in it that provides an incentive to employers to incentivize their employees through paid time off, for example, for taking a sick leave day. If your sick leave policy can allow for that, and then you are entitled to a refundable tax credit for the payment that you make to your employee for taking the time off to go get vaccinated. So that is one incentive that Congress has now laid out there. That is good and in effect only until September 30th of this year, but it started as of April the 1st. And if you did want to incentivize your employees in a way, you need to, as Jay and Cindy and Kim were all saying, you need to be careful how you apply it. but careful notwithstanding how you apply it, you can do it and get a refundable tax credit for having paid your employees for doing it.
Great. So a lot of discussion on the vaccines. We're coming up on, we've got about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure Doug gets to tell you all about Senate Bill 5, but real quick before we start that conversation, Cindy, what are some thoughts on the customer side? We have talked a lot about the employee side. Any considerations for how you're protecting your customers? You know, we hear about vaccine passports. I don't know of any business that's using that. I don't know that that's a thing, you know, in Kentucky. But we hear about it. Any considerations for how you're protecting your customers as this mask mandate is evolving under the CDC and then eventually come June 11th with the governor's announcements?
Well, I think it goes back to being industry specific, right? There are going to be some industries where you're going to have customers that are in close proximity to your employees. You're going to have customers that are just in close proximity to each other. And for you as a business, you'll have to decide what the safest route to proceed would be. A vaccine passport, I don't see a lot of tolerance for that. I actually had a client ask a similar question about vaccine mandates, and I said, let's let the cruise industry be the one to break that barrier. They're going to be the first one with the biggest incentive to require some sort of vaccine passport or something to prove vaccine status for that travel or that, you know, just to be able to participate in their events. And it's going to be a very difficult conversation to have and to roll out because you're still going to have accommodation issues, right? You're still going to have those ADA and maybe religious exemptions that you might have to apply. So when we're talking about our customers, I think you have to decide what the interface is. I imagine that we'll see those shields that we see at, you know, whether it's any retailer has a shield up between a cashier and a customer. I think those will continue, and I don't see any reason why not. You know, it's not onerous. It's already, the expense is already made. It doesn't infringe on anyone's rights to have some, you know, it's not a conversation that's polarizing like a mask. So I can see you doing as a business to protect customers and to protect your employees, having some of those protocols still in place. But I think that you have to really look for what your business looks like and how you could spread it if you had a large segment of unvaccinated individuals on the customer or employee side, and then what steps you will need to take. Once the mask mandate goes away, I don't see many businesses requiring masks for customers because they'll just go to the next store that doesn't, right? I mean, that it just won't work if you're requiring it. But I think there are other things that businesses can do to continue to protect employees and customers. And that might mean that they're going to require their employees to continue to wear masks because that will be maybe unpopular, but that's something they can still do. But it's going to be an industry specific inquiry.
Great, thank you. And I do want to throw it to Doug. So I want to make sure we talk about the liability protections afforded in Senate Bill 5. And then if we have time, there are some questions in the chat I want to circle back to. But Doug, can you tell us just a little bit about the types of protections the bill provides and who would benefit from those or who would make use of those? And if there's any considerations for your actions now to ensure that you're meeting any guidance or any requirements that are on the books now.
I will be happy to speak to Senate Bill 5 after I make one additional comment on this vaccination question that we were just doing. For those who are in the healthcare setting, and in particular, if you take Medicare or Medicaid in your healthcare setting or in long-term care settings, there was an interim final rule issued by CMS last Friday, I believe it was last Friday, on May the 11th, that basically, even in healthcare settings like that, doesn't require all staff to be vaccinated, but it requires any recipients of Medicaid or Medicare in the healthcare industry to educate their employees about why they should be vaccinated in that setting. The next step may be actual mandating of vaccination, but I do think people need to be aware of that rule that just came out last week in the healthcare setting. Now, with that stated, I will now address your Senate Bill 5 questions. Senate Bill 5 is a very interesting bill, and it has got the potential to be a major benefit for employers. And the reason I say potential is because there are some caveats to that. And I'll give you the caveats here in a minute. But let me first give you the two major components of Senate Bill 5. First, it provides a premises liability protection for business owners who have got public-facing businesses where you've got invitees, public persons, or visitors coming onto your premises. And those businesses are protected to the extent that with basically a liability protection. It's a change of the liability duties that would ordinarily apply to a business owner or a premises owner. It's structured in part upon the concept of premises owners can change their duties owed to the public when you invite those public invitees onto the premises, to the extent of any claims that arise out of the person claiming they caught COVID off your premises when they came onto it, either get from another customer because of your lack of your negligence or whatever, or maybe from one of your employees, they caught COVID-19. And if they're trying to blame your business for having gotten it on your premises, you've now got a modified duty by virtue of subsection 2 of Senate Bill 5. That's the long and the short of that aspect of it. So think of it from that standpoint. Public-facing businesses, you are protected to the extent somebody claims they got COVID on your premises. Second component, or for those who are more businesses that are more in the not necessarily providing public-facing businesses, inviting the public onto your premises, but if you're providing what's called essential services. And there is a large definition. I can't go through all of the ones. There's like 9 or 10 different categories that are considered essential services during this emergency. And in that situation, those who were providing essential services, which would include schools, which include healthcare settings, which include any number of settings, including lots of businesses that would overlap on the premises liability protections that are provided. But the essential services cover a number of categories. And if you are an essential service provider, you are extended the state's sovereign immunity. This is a interesting concept. There's only one case in the Commonwealth where the state's sovereign immunity has been extended, and it has been upheld as constitutional, notwithstanding a doctrine in our law that doesn't allow changes in tort actions. But that particular extension of sovereign immunity is a major breakthrough, and that we even got it enacted, and that the governor decided not to veto it. So it is now law. Now, I said a minute ago that there are a couple of caveats, and I say the potential protections that business owners or essential service providers have under Senate Bill 5. All of them expire whenever the emergency health declaration goes away, when it lapses or is allowed to expire. There has been several attempts actually, that the legislature took to take away the governor's ability to even extend an emergency declaration with emergency orders. And those efforts are from Senate Bill 1 as well as House Joint Resolution 77. There's a couple of them, the legislations that passed that would have basically ended the governor's ability to maintain the emergency declaration right now. And were it not for a Franklin Circuit Court opinion from Judge Shepard in Franklin Circuit Court that put a temporary restraining order, temporary injunction on those bills, I would be telling you that Senate Bill 5 isn't really offering you a whole lot of benefit right now, because it would have already expired. Now, it is retroactive back to March 6th of 2020. So if somebody were to sue you saying that I got COVID back on February 2021 or some date earlier this year, then you would still have the benefits of Senate Bill 5. But as far as going forward, you wouldn't necessarily have those benefits. But because of that Franklin Circuit Court temporary injunction, those bills that would have ended the governor's ability to continue and maintain the emergency declaration have been stopped in their tracks. Now, that stated, the executive order that the governor entered last week, where he said that June the 11th, things will be relaxing even more, it does expressly state in the beginning of that executive order that he is maintaining the health emergency. So I think that declaration in that executive order will keep Senate bill alive for the time being. And even if he relaxes the mask mandate even further, or the congregations of peoples that do or do not have to, inside or outdoor, indoors or outdoors, I think right now it's what, at 1,000 or so that you can gather. But if he relaxes those matters even further, but still leaves the emergency declaration in place, then Senate Bill 5's protections will continue going forward, as long as that temporary injunction is maintained in Franklin Circuit Court. Now, I don't know how long that injunction will last, and those who filed, those who have been fighting against the governor's seeking of that temporary injunction may ask to lift it in light of the fact that things are relaxing. And so we just have to keep watching and seeing how long the emergency declaration stays in place for what you can and cannot do. Let me give one last caveat, and then I'll shut up and answer questions, Kate, whatever you may have on further clarifications. With respect to the premises owners, you are expected to follow what's called executive action. Now, executive action is broadly defined. It's defined to be federal government action, federal government and governmental agency action, the president, the governor, state government. So that's why you want to pay attention to what the CDC is doing or OSHA is doing. And I think for the most part right now, OSHA is collapsing its guidance into what the CDC is guiding. And certainly the governor is following CDC. That's the reason he's come out. So look at the most, if you're wanting to be as open as possible and still take the benefit of Senate Bill 5 and its liability protections, follow the least restrictive federal or state governmental guidance that you want to follow. And then you're still going to have some of those protections. But I do want to caveat that Senate Bill 5 raises constitutionality questions, and it may be that it gets challenged. So you may rely on it, but at the end of the day, you may end up having to, or your insurance carrier, if you're carried for liability lawsuits, may end up having to litigate the constitutionality of Senate Bill 5. But it is grounded on some constitutional validity theories. And those just remain untested. There is some authority, though, from Kentucky court cases that would seem to point in the direction that Senate Bill 5 has gone about as far as you can go, but has gone to the limits of constitutionality in providing the liability protections. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that it is primarily geared toward COVID-19 claims. A claimant who wants to say, I have gotten COVID-19 because I was either working on your premises or I was coming onto your premises and got it from an employee or a fellow customer. And those protections, the Senate Bill 5 does not change workers' comp. So to the extent you got a workers' comp claim that comes in from an employee saying they got it, that's going to have to play itself out in the workers' comp process. But if you get a customer that does, or an employee that says I had unfairness and you discriminated against me arising out of COVID-19 because you were not applying your policies correctly, arguably, you could get protection under Senate Bill 5 for a discrimination claim, arguably not. That remains to see how it gets played out. But there is some arguable nature of it, at least as to state discrimination claims. Now, it would not change federal civil rights laws that protect religion or reasonable accommodations for disabilities or disabled status. But beyond that, let me just back up and say that's the synopsis that I would provide, Kate.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. And while you were talking, I posted a couple of links in the chat. One is a story about the bill when it became law, and then the actual bill language, if you want to see the definition that Doug mentioned for essential service provider. That's pretty lengthy. As well as the details of the bill. So I encourage you all to grab those links, and we will continue to track it. And if it does get challenged in the courts, we do engage in certain cases from time to time on behalf of the business community on different things. So we're going to be all in on that. We have just a couple minutes left. There are a couple of questions in the chat. There's one here about how do you handle a situation where a client requires everyone to be vaccinated and your employee has to go on site to provide them the service, but they are not vaccinated. This is getting into your contracts maybe with someone.
Yeah, Kate, and I'll jump in. Yeah, and I was looking at the chat questions, and there seem to be several of them that all go back towards how vaccinated employees interact and mesh with unvaccinated employees, and also, customers. And that's probably going to be the biggest challenge right now, is shaping your policies. A week ago, I think we all would have given pretty consistent advice, at least on the workplace. OSHA was saying you should treat everybody the same, whether they're vaccinated or not. You should have everybody follow masking and social distancing. Part of what they said is, we're waiting to see what the CDC says. They're still studying it. And that got answered. But also part of it's a concern over discrimination. If you have different policies and some people wearing masks and some not, is it opening the door to asking why they're not? And how far should you ask? Do you get into accommodation questions, religious exemption questions? The more questions you ask there, the more exposure you have. And it's going to be, unfortunately, right now, like, I think a lot of policy decisions you make as an employer, that's going to be weighing and balancing some benefits and risks. There's unfortunately not a black and white answer on this. It's going to be different for large employers and small employers. It's going to be different for those that have a confined workplace versus those that have guests versus those that go out on site. And you're going to have to look at each kind of situation and determine, is it worth the headaches and the risks it caused by having different classes of people, following different rules, or do you want to go with an all or nothing, which is, some of the companies acting quickly, in the last few days. That's kind of what I've been seeing, at least. Some with clients, more just kind of reading up to see what others are doing. You're seeing people saying, we're staying exactly how it is, everybody still wear masks, or more often I'm seeing, okay, masks are gone, or masks will be gone after June 11th. And then you see some hybrids. I've certainly seen a handful of customers are on the honor system for now, and maybe no masks, June 11th for vaccinated people, but employees still are wearing masks, either for public protection or their own protection. But that's the most challenging one right now. And probably the advice I've been giving, because I think it was Cindy that mentioned, let's see what the cruise industry does. There's a little bit of that too. We gave that advice a year ago. It's tempting. We've been, confined so long under these rules so long. Everybody wants to be, the first one to open up their doors and get people back in. It might be best just to slow down, let it play out for at least a couple weeks, see if we get some more government guidance, see what your peers are doing. Are you at risk of losing a little business during that time by not being first to open up? Possibly. But is waiting a couple weeks, really worth the one being out front, being the guinea pig? Because you're probably going to be a little safer if you watch for more guidance for what peers are doing and kind of follow the lead and the trends a little. Kind of some thoughts from here, and I'll let Cindy and Kim give any additional thoughts on how to, treat vaccinated versus unvaccinated the same or differently. That's the toughest question I think we're all facing.
Cindy, Kim, any final thoughts?
Well, I will say I did get that question from a client about how they had their client required vaccinated employees to be on site. And my client didn't want to ask the question, and my client also didn't want to force the vaccine. And what would you do if you had a fully unvaccinated workforce, but the client site you're going to requires vaccinations? And so, it's a little bit, to your point, I think at the beginning, Kate, you said, well, it's a contract question. Let's see what the contract says. But if it's a brand new contract, there has to be exceptions to be made for the ADA and for religious exemptions. Outside of that, a personal belief or fear of the vaccine isn't going to be enough. And that could change the dynamic, getting some unvaccinated people vaccinated, right? They might say, well, if I can't do my job because the client sites are requiring it, and my own personal fear and my right to choose will mean I'm excluded from this industry, that might change their perspective or they'll change their jobs. And so it's a conversation that has to be had when we're talking about those clients or vendors who are going to require third parties to be vaccinated, and how the employer is going to handle it. It's going to, I think, one, you look at your contract, two, you look at your workforce, and then, you just have to have those conversations. But Kim, I'm sure you've also got some other ideas, or you might have addressed a similar issue.
No, Cindy, I think that's exactly right. I would agree with you. And I think, these things, like we said, are rapidly evolving, and for different clients, things are going to be handled in a different way. And so it's all going to be sort of fact dependent on what's happening. Is the employee who's not getting vaccinated, do they have a medical reason for that, or do they have a religious reason for that? And if so, we need to accommodate that. We need to deal with it. If not, the circumstances are different. So again, I think it's all just going to be sort of fact dependent. And unfortunately, employers are going to have to work through this very carefully and on a fact by fact or fact dependent situation. And so obviously we're here to help in any way that we can. And I know the chamber has also provided a lot of guidance on a lot of different topics. And so, we're all here to help and be resources to the extent that we can. And we're happy to do that. So I know, Kate, we're a couple of minutes over, and you said we never go over an hour.
Never.
So I'm gonna be quiet.
No, it's a great topic. I knew people would have a lot of questions. So hopefully we got through all of your all's questions. And we didn't talk about this, but one of the bigger challenges, or equally as big challenge right now, are some of our workforce shortages. And so, how you handle this in the context of worker shortages makes it even more complicated in terms of what you can do and what you'll choose to do, not choose to do. So the challenges of COVID-19 are not over. Businesses still face lots of dilemmas about how to handle this. So we will be here for you to help you in any way we can going forward. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much to our panelists. Really appreciate your all's expertise. I know you are probably busier than ever, and taking an hour out of your day to talk with our business folks. We really appreciate it. So thanks so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take
Kate.
care and be safe.